Let's move on. A fatal shooting by police in Hamilton over the weekend has brought on a SIU investigation. What goes into such investigations? How does the SIU come to its conclusions? A lot of people asking questions, and it has led to an independent review of all three branches of police oversight in the province, including information regarding the SIU and whether their reports should be made public. To talk more about all of this, Dave McCormack is with us, Executive Vice President of Business Development, Investigative Solutions Network Incorporated, and is on the line with us now. Hello, Dave. How are you today?
I'm well, Scott. How are you?
Good. Thanks for taking the time to join us. What can you tell us about an SIU investigation? When is it called? What happens? How does the process start? What is the protocol?
Well, the protocol in Ontario is that any time a member of the public comes into contact with the police that results in a serious injury as defined in the SIU's mandate. So those types of injuries that are more than merely transient or trifling in nature, and also injuries resulting from sexual assault. So things like fractures to limbs, ribs, vertebrae, skull, burns to the major part of the body or a loss of a body part, loss of vision, loss of hearing, or any allegation of sexual assault. Police services in Ontario are obligated by law to notify the SIU. The SIU at that point in time will determine whether or not, based on the information that it receives from that notification, it will or will not invoke its mandate. So if the SIU invokes its mandate, then they take carriage of that investigation into the actions of the police officer or police officers and the resulting injury that the member of the public received. What we also have to remember is whatever the original interaction was that brought the police into contact with that individual or individuals also needs to be investigated, and the police of local jurisdiction will continue along the lines with that investigations. So it's quite often that you'll have two investigations into the same thing running contemporaneously, and often in a very mutual, efficient manner. It avoids some of the duplication, for example, forensic identification, those types of things.
So who makes up the SIU?
Well, the SIU is led by an SIU director who is appointed, and under that director there is investigative teams, specialists in all areas of FIS, for example, forensic identification, interviewing, crime scene specialists, much like you would have in a police force. You would have everybody who has those requisite skills to go out and conduct a very thorough and competent investigation into a criminal matter.
So are they police officers from various forces? I mean, because we hear lots of complaints about the police investigating the police. So is that in fact what it is?
To a certain part it is. A lot of the investigators are former police officers, but not all. The SIU does have investigators who have come from different walks of life, different branches of investigation, some from different branches of the ministry, for example. And they're very clear, though, that the police officers that are on the SIU are not allowed to conduct investigations into the police service that they came from. So in Toronto, for example, or Hamilton, for example, if the SIU had an investigator who was a former Hamilton officer or a Toronto officer, they would be excluded from any investigations anywhere near Toronto or Hamilton.
So the SIU is a separate unit to police. It's not police investigating other police forces.
Absolutely. It's a civilian law enforcement agency that's independent of the police.
Should SIU reports be made public?
I think that's a tough call. I think we have to always worry about or be concerned with the privacy of all people involved, including the officers that were involved and the members of the public. I think certain aspects of the SIU investigations are probably going to be released in the near future if they haven't been already. And I'm thinking more along the lines of the administrative review that is conducted by the police officer, by the police service after the SIU has come to a conclusion. That is where the police service, usually the professional standards branch, looks at the actions of the police or the police officers that were involved to ensure that all of its rules, policies, procedures were followed. Did the officers act within the confines of its own governance? Now, the SIU does not have a mandate to look at that. The SIU can only look at criminality.
So when there is something like a shooting, automatically the SIU is brought in. How do they justify? How do they justify whether the officer used enough force, too much force? How do they justify all of that?
Well, the SIU will conduct a very thorough and long and intensive and extensive investigation into the surroundings of the event. They'll interview all of the possible witnesses. They'll have medical releases signed so that they can obtain the medical records from the hospitals. They will certainly look for every body of evidence. They will obtain notes from the officers involved. They will get interviews with the officers involved. And at the end of their thorough investigative decision, they have to apply pretty much the same policy that the police have to apply in when they're going to lay charges. So they have to determine that if the police officers were acting within the law, and that is the Criminal Code, Section 25, where it lays out how much force or the use of force that a police officer can use when engaged in the execution of their duty. So they take a look at that and they have to determine, did this police officer cross the line, or was the force used acceptable for the totality of the circumstances that that officer faced at that time and what he or she was thinking, and what based on all of that, they then determine whether or not the officer has overstepped their bounds and committed a criminal offense, or if they were well within reason under Section 25 of the Code.
Is there a way to provide more transparency in this process?
I'm not sure that everybody will always be satisfied. Even if the full reports were released with no redacting at all, I think you would still hear from some people saying, well, it was police investigating police. It's not transparent. They're withholding information. They didn't interview everybody. So I don't think that we're ever going to see a situation where everybody is totally satisfied. At the end of this, somebody is going to feel aggrieved. Fully releasing all of the reports may appear to provide more transparency. It also may cause more problems down the road than they anticipate.
What are the first steps when the SIU is contacted and brought to the scene? What's the protocol there?
Well, the first steps would be that most police services have an SIU liaison officer or officers. So the officer in charge of the certain division where the event happens, or the duty inspector, given the size of the service, if there is any indication that this might be a matter where the SIU needs to be contacted, they would attend the scene, get all of the information that they can from the officer or the supervisors that are on the scene, try to determine the roles of the involved officers, that is what each officer did, and then determine based on the overall rather quick investigation that they're going to do at that point in time whether we have a threshold injury or not. That is broken bones and on all of those things that I mentioned earlier, the definition of serious injury. If at that point in time, and not after it's been confirmed in the hospital, but if at that point in time the senior officer or the duty officer determines that this is likely going to be an SIU matter, then they contact the on-call SIU team. The SIU team will make a quick assessment based on the information provided, and the SIU team will then come back and say, yes, we are invoking the mandate, or no, we are not invoking the mandate. If they are invoking the mandate, then the police service of local jurisdiction essentially has to lock down that scene, ensuring that they're still caring for injured people and continuing on with the investigation into whatever that original matter that was that brought them to the scene. And then the SIU rolls out all of their teams of investigators, whoever's been assigned to it, with all of the requisite equipment and support staff that they require, and then they are then in charge of that investigation as far as the actions of the police officer.
So, in fact, there's actually two investigations going on, one for the initial crime scene and then one from the SIU.
Absolutely.
How do police officers feel about the SIU?
Well, the SIU has been around for quite a while now, and I can tell you in Toronto specifically, it's one of those things that we know is out there, and for the most part, it's considered to be a good thing. We understand, and the police officers in Toronto understand that there needs to be levels of oversight, and police officers do need to be held accountable for their actions. So it's I hesitate to say the cost of doing business because that's not a fair way to put it, but they recognize that they have to carry out their duties within the confines of the law, or there could be potentially be consequences that they have to face.
Do they always cooperate with the SIU?
In my experience has been that for the most part they do. I mean, they're certainly the subject officer and the witness officers that are involved are allowed to have legal representation, and that is brought in very quickly. And part of the legal representation is to advise the officers to cooperate with the SIU and provide whatever it is that they are legally obligated to provide.
Obviously, there are questions specifically around transparency. I can't see that going away. So how do we move forward with this? How do we make people feel more comfortable that the SIU is doing its job and to the best interest of the public?
Well, that's a wonderful question. I think that the SIU needs to be as transparent as they possibly can with the public. And I hate to say that the SIU needs to lay more charges just for the sake of showing the public that they are out there and they are doing their duty, because I think that's a slippery slope. I think they do a good job now of assessing the situation, of weighing all of the evidence, of doing thorough and fair investigations and making the proper decisions at the end of the day. But the SIU needs to, in my opinion, get out and kind of sell themselves to the public that we are working in your best interests, and we are thoroughly investigating these, and we are competent, and for the most part, the police officers followed their training, and the police officer was justified in doing what he or she did. And you're bang on, though, that we're never going to satisfy everybody who's involved in this, because they are very serious situations, and somebody has either died or been seriously injured after an interaction with the police. So there's a lot of emotion at stake. There's a lot of people taking to the streets sometimes and claiming that it was motivated by something other than the facts at issue that were in the original event that brought the police and the person together.
How does the SIU feel about lapel cameras? Will this, obviously, this would aid them greatly, would it not?
Well, I can't tell you how they feel about them because I've never had that conversation with anyone from the SIU, but I think any collection of evidence that provides a true representation of what happened at that time and in that place and what was said by all involved within audio range can only help any investigation, SIU or otherwise.
How important is it that the public has confidence in the SIU? Are they concerned about the lack of confidence that some may have?
Well, I think it's extremely important that the public has confidence in the SIU. And the SIU is the watchdog over the police as far as criminal events go. They have to be seen by the public to be out there, to be independent, to be conducting thorough investigations, and to come up with the right decisions based on all of the evidence at the end of the investigation. I think that's hugely important for the SIU to continue and for police officers and the public to feel that, yes, everybody is getting a fair shake in this investigation. Everyone's interests are being represented as best as possible within the confines of the law. Are
we looking more closely at police and how they do their duties than we have in the past? How does technology come into play with all of this?
No, we are very much looking at how the police officers do their duty much more greatly than we ever did in the past. You've struck on it with the introduction of lapel cams, in-car camera systems in police cars, public and private surveillance that is all over the place, especially in places like downtown Toronto, downtown Hamilton. Almost every business establishment has some sort of a security camera, often pointing out into the street. We have CCTV in many jurisdictions that's recording what's going on in those areas, and virtually every member of the public is walking around with a video and a digital camera in their hands, and they are actively and in the face of law enforcement recording those interactions.
For those reasons, what is your feeling on lapel cams? Should they have them? I mean, obviously all evidence is good, but what are some of the challenges? Is it just a matter of time before every officer has one?
I think it is a matter of time before every officer has one. I think cost is a large issue preventing it at this point in time. Not the cost of the actual devices themselves, but of the storage of the data.
Yeah.
I think it's a good thing. I think it protects the officers as much as it protects the citizens, and I think the pilot project in Toronto not that long ago showed that it puts the citizens and the police on their best behavior, as both sides should be at all times.
Good point. Obviously, we have seen what's happening in the United States, and we certainly can't compare two countries, although many times a lot of this stuff and feelings come across the border. Do you notice a difference on the street from police officers that you know and you've talked to? Is it different now than it was even 5-10 years ago? Unfortunately, is what we're seeing in the States creeping its way up into Canada, and by that I mean the perception we have of police?
Sadly, I think it is. I think everything that we see as an emerging trend in the United States does eventually hit Canada, especially Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, the larger jurisdictions, and we see it somewhere in the 8 to 10 years later range. The changing of how the police on the street feel within the last 5 years is definitely there, and I can speak to Toronto specifically. The amount of change that has taken place within that organization has been massive, and it's very tough to adapt to ongoing change. And we've seen the removal of carding, we've seen the introduction of lapel cameras, we've seen drastic changes. They had a big change in their management record system, which created a lot of consternation. Anytime you have to learn anything new and things are different than the way they used to be, it certainly creates a lot of issues. So the turmoil within the Toronto Police Force based just on change is huge, and it leaves the officers in a situation where they're not really sure, what to do, because a police officer will always do their job. They will always follow the law. They will always be out there performing their core duties. But I think we're in a situation right now where they're saying, I'm really not sure where I stand with the SIU. I'm really not sure where I stand with the OIPRD. We've had so much change. I'm going to do my job, but I'm just going to do my job. I'm going to go to my calls. I'm going to answer those calls. I'm going to provide good service. I'm going to provide good customer service, and I'm going to wait for my next call, because there is a state of uncertainty. They're not sure who has their backs is the fact out there right now.
This was interesting, and again, not to compare Canada to the United States, but this actually made it onto the debates the other night. And are we putting too much pressure on police to solve society's problems, whether it's mental illness, whether it's terrorism, whether this, that, or the other, gangs or such? Are we putting too much pressure on the police services to solve these larger problems?
I think, Scott, we absolutely are, and we've seen that over the years where the police have been the gatekeepers of all of society's problems. I think for the longest time the police were willing to do that, and I think they did it fairly well, but you see such issues facing the police now as far as budget, as far as what they can do. In an attempt to do more with less just doesn't work. And I think the police have to take the tactic now that they have to do less with less. And that is to say, get back to those issues of core policing, those things that they are obligated to do under the Police Services Act, those things that they are obligated to do under the Criminal Code, and focus on that, what they do best. And let other social agencies deal with those matters that they do best. I mean, the police are not a panacea. They're not a silver bullet to solving all of society's problems. And in the past, they pretty much have been go and solve every problem that society faces, never knowing what the next radio call is going to be. And very often it would have nothing to do with policing. I think that's one of the reasons that you see these hub models working so well, where you bring all of representatives from certain agencies together to deal with these issues at their core before they become bigger issues, before they become criminal matters where the police have to get too involved and people end up in jail, where perhaps some intervention early by the right society could have put them on a better path. So I think we'll see more of those hub models coming. They are effective, and they're more cost efficient than just throwing more and more money at the police to try to solve these issues that really they're not trained 100% to do.
Obviously, you're touching on mental illness. There's lots of scenarios, including here in Hamilton, where they're trying to work together and bring these agencies together to all work together and help de-escalate the situation. Is that where you see this going? I mean, do we have the resources to do that in order to help with officers on the front lines with people who might have experience in these areas?
Yeah, I really do think that's where we're going. I think that is a sustainable model, and it's not just mental illness. You're looking at socioeconomic issues. You're looking at poverty. You're looking at some priority neighborhoods where if kids are given an option to go to some social programs, to get involved in after-school clubs, to get involved in other things to keep them off the streets, so to speak, to say that there's an opportunity to show them the allure of gang life is not really what it's cracked up to be. When you see the gang shootings, the gang-on-gang violence, and pointing out to them that you could end up that way, here's a hub model that is willing to work with you to put you on the right path to some form of success and to keep you away from those issues. So it goes beyond mental illness. You're bang on that mental illness is a big part of it, but it's certainly a lot more to offer than just that.
Dave McCormack has been with us, Executive Vice President of Business Development, Investigative Solution Network Incorporated, talking about police and SIU and the protocol involved. Dave, thanks very much for the time and insight.